Sometimes the wrong door doesn't lead to a mistake. It leads to the life you were never supposed to have. Claire Bennett was already 10 minutes late, her shoes damp from the cold rain soaking through the thin soles as she hurried across the polished marble lobby, clutching a folder that had been folded too many times, edges soft from worry and use, her cream-colored knitted scarf clinging slightly to her neck, still carrying the faint scent of home, of something warm she was afraid of losing. She paused in front of a wall of elevators, breath unsteady, scanning the small printed sign she had screenshotted earlier, room 42B, interview for administrative assistant. She pressed the button without thinking, stepping into the first elevator that opened, her reflection in the mirrored walls looking smaller than she felt, pale, nervous, but holding on, always holding on. When the doors opened again, everything felt wrong. The carpet was thicker, the air quieter, the kind of silence that didn't belong to job interviews but to decisions that changed lives. She hesitated, but a voice behind her said, "This floor," and she moved forward instinctively, her heart beating faster as she followed the hallway, until she reached a large set of double doors slightly open. Voices inside low, serious. She swallowed, knocked lightly, and stepped in before anyone answered. And that was the moment everything stopped. A long table, men in tailored suits, a woman with a tablet mid-sentence, and at the head of it all, a man who didn't look surprised. Adrian Vale didn't raise his voice, didn't frown. He simply looked at her, and the room fell silent like someone had pulled the sound out of the air. Claire froze, fingers tightening around her folder. "I'm so sorry. I think I have the wrong." But he lifted a hand slightly, not to stop her, just enough to make her words disappear. His eyes dropped for a brief second to the scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, damp at the edges, then back to her face, calm, unreadable. "You're here for the interview," he said, not as a question, and something in his tone made it feel like the answer had already been decided. Claire blinked, confused. "Yes. I think so, I was told." "Good," he cut in softly, turning slightly to the others. "Give us the room." There was hesitation, a glance exchanged, but no one argued. Chairs shifted, footsteps faded, and within seconds, the door closed behind them, leaving Claire alone in a room that suddenly felt far too large, far too expensive, far too quiet. She took a small step back, unsure. "I really think I'm in the wrong place," she said again, more gently this time, but Adrian stood slowly, not rushed, not impatient, just certain, and walked toward her with a presence that didn't need to prove anything, stopping just close enough for her to feel it, but not close enough to overwhelm. His gaze steady, almost curious. "No," he said, voice low, even. "You walked into exactly the right place." Claire's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the worn edge of her folder, as if it was the only familiar thing left in the room. "I'm just looking for a job," she said quietly, almost apologetically, and for a moment, something shifted in his expression, something so small it could have been imagined. But it wasn't cold, not entirely. "What if," he said, after a pause that felt longer than it was, "I told you I'm not offering you a job?" Claire frowned slightly, confusion replacing fear. "Then, I think I should leave," she answered, honest, because that was all she knew how to be. But Adrian didn't move to let her pass, didn't block her either. He simply held her there with a calm that felt heavier than pressure. "What if I told you?" he continued, voice quieter now, almost like he was testing the weight of the words himself. "I'm offering you a way out." Claire's heart skipped, not because she believed him, but because part of her wanted to. "A way out of what?" she asked barely, above a whisper, and Adrian's eyes didn't leave hers when he answered. "Everything that's about to break you." The room felt smaller suddenly, the silence louder, the rain still faintly tapping against the distant glass. Claire didn't understand how a stranger could say something like that, or why it felt like he wasn't guessing, but seeing, and that scared her more than anything else. She shook her head slightly, grounding herself. "I don't think you know anything about me," she said, trying to hold on to logic, to something safe. But Adrian reached into his pocket, pulling out a pen, placing it gently on the table behind him, then sliding a single document forward. "You're right," he said calmly, "but I know enough." Claire's eyes moved to the paper, then back to him, her pulse uneven. "This isn't an interview," she said slowly. realization beginning to settle in her chest. No, he replied, just as steady. It's an offer. She hesitated, the scarf around her neck suddenly feeling warmer, heavier, like it was holding her in place between two lives. What kind of offer? She asked, and Adrian didn't hesitate this time, not even for a second. A marriage, he said, and the word didn't echo, didn't crash. It just landed quietly, like something inevitable. Claire stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. I'm sorry, what? And Adrian met her confusion without softening it, without explaining it away. You don't need a job, Claire, he said, her name sounding unfamiliar in his voice, like it already belonged in a different world. You need a contract, her breath faltered, and I need a wife. Claire did not move, her fingers slowly loosening around the folder as if the weight of it no longer made sense. That is not funny, she said quietly, not angry, just confused in a way that felt deeper than words. Adrian did not smile. It was not meant to be, he replied, his tone calm, almost clinical, as if he had already walked through this conversation 100 times in his mind. Claire shook her head, taking a small step back. You do not even know me, she said, her voice trembling. Just slightly. And this time Adrian did not deny it. I know enough, he repeated, then gestured toward the chair across from the table. Sit. She hesitated, every instinct telling her to leave, to walk out of the wrong place and return to the small, familiar world she understood. But the rain outside, the overdue bills, the call she had ignored that morning from the hospital, all of it pressed quietly against her chest. She sat, slowly, carefully, like stepping onto uncertain ground. Adrian remained standing for a moment before taking his seat across from her, the distance between them measured, controlled. This is a 6-month arrangement, he said, sliding the document closer. A legal marriage, publicly recognized, privately structured. Claire looked down at the paper but did not touch it. The words blurred together. Why me? She asked, because nothing else made sense. Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. Because you are not part of my world, he said, simple, direct. That makes you safe. The word landed heavier than she expected. Safe for him, not for her. Claire swallowed. Safe for what? She asked, and Adrian did not look away. For a situation that requires control, he answered. My family is forcing a merger that depends on my marital status. If I do not marry within 30 days, I lose majority control of my company. Claire blinked, trying to process how something like that could be real. So you just pick someone, she said, and there was a flicker in his expression, something quieter. No, he said. I choose carefully. Claire let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. And you chose me, she said, disbelief still sitting in every word. Adrian nodded once. Yes. He did not rush to explain further, and somehow that made it feel more real. Claire looked down at her hands, at the faint crease in her skin where the cold had settled earlier. And what do I get? She asked, because she needed to hear it clearly, needed to understand the cost of staying versus leaving. Adrian reached for another page, turning it toward her. Full medical coverage for your mother at Westbridge Medical Center, he said, his voice steady. Private room, specialist care, no billing limits. Claire's breath caught, sharp and sudden. She looked up at him, eyes searching. How do you know about my mom? She asked, and Adrian did not hesitate. Because I do not make offers without understanding the person I am making them to. The room felt colder, not physically, but in the way truth sometimes does. Claire's chest tightened. So you looked into my life, she said softly, and Adrian did not deny it. Yes. Claire leaned back slightly, the scarf around her neck brushing against her chin, grounding her in something real, something hers. And if I say no? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. Adrian's voice did not change. Then you walk out of that door, he said. And nothing about your life changes. The simplicity of it hurt more than pressure would have. Claire closed her eyes for a brief second, hearing the echo of hospital machines, the quiet strain in her mother's voice pretending everything was fine. When she opened them again, Adrian was still there, still watching, still waiting, not pushing, not pleading, just offering. I do not need you to love me, he said after a moment, his tone lower now, almost distant. I just need you to stay. Claire's fingers finally moved, brushing the edge of the contract, her reflection faintly visible in the polished table, small, uncertain, but standing at the edge of something that could change everything. She looked at him one more time, searching for something human beneath the control. "And what happens after 6 months?" she asked quietly. Adrian's answer came without hesitation, but softer than before. "Then you are free." And somehow, that word felt heavier than the contract itself. Claire did not remember signing her name, only the way her hand trembled slightly as the pen moved across the paper, and how Adrian watched without interrupting, as if he understood that moment was heavier for her than any words could explain. The next few days blurred together in a quiet rush. Legal meetings, measurements for clothes she never imagined wearing, instructions delivered in calm voices that never raised or questioned, everything efficient, everything precise, and through it all, Adrian remained the same, composed, distant, never crossing a line, never offering comfort either. The wedding itself was small but public, cameras flashing, questions thrown like soft storms she was not ready for, but Adrian stood beside her, steady, one hand lightly at her back, not intimate, just enough to anchor her in place. When it was over, she expected something to shift, something to feel different. But instead she found herself standing in front of a glass wall on the top floor of a penthouse that looked out over the entire city, lights stretching for miles like something unreal. The space behind her was quiet, too quiet, no warmth, no sound of a lived life, just clean lines and expensive silence. "This will be your room," Adrian said from a few steps away, his voice even, as if he was assigning a role, not sharing a home. Claire turned slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of her cream scarf, grounding herself. "Again, and yours?" she asked softly. Adrian gestured down the hall. "Separate," he said. "We keep appearances in public, structure in private." Claire nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the word structure. It felt less like a home and more like a carefully built distance. Later that night, unable to sleep, she stepped quietly into the hallway, the soft carpet absorbing her footsteps. A faint light was still on beneath the door at the end. She hesitated, then moved closer. Without thinking, and just as she reached the door, she heard it, the sharp sound of glass hitting the floor, followed by silence that felt too heavy to ignore. Claire froze, her hand hovering near the door, her breath shallow. She knew she should walk away, respect the boundaries he had set so clearly, but something in that silence felt wrong, not angry, not loud, just breaking. And before she could stop herself, she knocked gently, once, then softer. "Are you okay?" she asked through the door, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment there was no response, and then Adrian's voice came, lower than she had ever heard it, controlled, but not untouched. "Go back to your room, Claire." And she should have listened, she really should have, but instead she stayed, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her scarf. "You do not sound okay," she said, and the silence that followed felt different this time, less distant, more fragile. And then slowly, the door opened just enough for her to see him, his expression unreadable, but his hand, the one resting against the door, trembling just slightly, like something he was trying very hard to hide. His eyes met hers, steady, but not as closed as before. "You were not supposed to see this," he said quietly, and Claire did not step back this time. She did not look away either. "I am not going to tell anyone," she answered, just as softly. And for the first time, Adrian did not respond right away, as if her staying there, in that quiet moment, had changed something he did not expect. Adrian held the door for a second longer than necessary, as if deciding whether to close it or let her see more than he intended. But he stepped back instead, not an invitation, not quite, just the absence of refusal. Claire moved inside slowly, careful, like entering a space that was not built for her. The room was dim, one lamp casting a soft light across a desk scattered with papers, and a single broken glass on the floor, a thin line of water spreading quietly across the wood. Adrian did not look at it, his attention fixed somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the walls. Claire reached for a nearby cloth without asking and knelt down, gently pressing it against the spill, her movements small, steady, familiar, like something she had done 100 times in a life far from this one. Adrian watched her for a moment, then turned away, running a hand through his hair as if trying to reset something inside himself. "You do not have to do that," he said, his voice back to its controlled calm, but softer around the edges. Claire did not stop. "I know," she replied quietly, "but I am already here." The words settled in the space between them, simple, but different from anything he was used to. When she stood up again, she placed the cloth aside neatly, not leaving a trace behind, not making it a moment worth remembering. But it was. Adrian exhaled slowly, as if something in him had loosened without permission. "It is nothing," he said, almost automatically, and Claire shook her head just slightly, her scarf brushing against her shoulder. "It did not sound like nothing," she answered, her voice gentle, not pushing, not asking for more than he could give. Adrian looked at her then, really looked, not as someone he had chosen for a role, but as someone who had stayed when she should have left, and that unsettled him more than anything else. The next morning, everything returned to structure, schedules placed on the table, events marked clearly, expectations defined. Claire followed them carefully, learning how to walk beside him in public, how to smile when needed, how to remain silent when eyes judged her presence. But small things began to shift. Adrian no longer ignored her completely. He noticed when she skipped breakfast. He adjusted his pace slightly when she struggled in heels on marble floors. He did not say anything about it, but the distance between them was no longer empty. It was filled with quiet awareness. One evening before a formal dinner, Claire stood still as Adrian adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, his fingers brushing hers for just a second too long, both of them noticing, neither pulling away immediately. "You are doing fine," he said, low, almost absent. But it was the first time his words sounded like reassurance instead of instruction. Claire nodded, her eyes lifting to meet his, something unspoken passing between them, fragile, new, and dangerous, because it did not belong in a contract, and yet it was there, growing in the silence neither of them knew how to break. Days turned into a rhythm that felt almost normal, but never entirely real. Mornings began with quiet breakfasts where words were few but no longer absent. Claire learned how Adrian took his coffee, black, untouched until it cooled slightly, and Adrian learned that Claire always wrapped her scarf twice around her neck even when the room was warm, as if it held something she could not afford to lose. Their lives moved in parallel lines that slowly, carefully, began to lean toward each other. Not crossing, not yet, but no longer distant. One afternoon, Claire received a call from the hospital. Her mother had been moved into a private room, the kind she had only seen in magazines. Clean white sheets, soft lighting, machines that hummed quietly instead of loudly. She stood there beside the bed, holding her mother's hand, trying to explain without explaining, and when she stepped out into the hallway, she saw Adrian at the far end, standing still, hands in his coat pockets, as if he had been there longer than he intended to admit. "You did not have to come," she said softly, walking toward him, and Adrian shook his head slightly. "I was already nearby," he replied, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. They stood there for a moment, the quiet between them no longer heavy, just present. "Thank you," Claire said, her voice more certain than before, and Adrian looked at her, really looked, not at the role she played, but at the person standing in front of him. It was part of the agreement, he said. But the words did not land the same way they used to, because now they sounded like something he was reminding himself of, not her. Later that evening, back in the penthouse, Claire noticed a folder left slightly open on the desk. She did not mean to look, but her name caught her eye. Neat, typed, organized. She hesitated, then opened it just enough to understand. Records, notes, details about her life, her work history, her financial struggles, even the hospital visits. Everything laid out carefully, deliberately. Her chest tightened, not from anger, but from the quiet realization that nothing about this had been accidental. When Adrian walked in, he saw it immediately, the folder in her hand, the shift in her expression, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You knew," Claire said finally, her voice low, steady. From the beginning. Adrian did not deny it. He closed the distance between them slowly, not defensive, not apologetic, just honest. "Yes," he answered, and the simplicity of it hurt more than any excuse could have. Claire looked down at the pages, then back at him. So I did not walk into the wrong place, she said, the words forming slowly, carefully. You were already waiting. Adrian held her gaze, something unreadable flickering beneath the surface. I recognized you, he said, his voice quieter now, less controlled. From the hospital, months ago. You stayed with a woman who was not even related to you. You gave up your place in line, and you never asked for anything in return. Claire's breath caught slightly. She remembered that day, but she never thought anyone else had noticed. So you chose me, she said, not as a question this time, but as something she was trying to understand. Adrian nodded once. Because you were not like the people in my world, he said, and I needed someone who would not pretend. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her scarf, the fabric soft but grounding. Or someone who would not leave, she added quietly. And this time Adrian did not respond right away, because the truth in that was deeper than he had intended to reveal. The room felt different now. The silence no longer neutral, but filled with something more fragile, more complicated. Claire placed the folder back on the desk, carefully, like she did not want to disturb the balance that had been building between them. You could have told me, she said softly, and Adrian's answer came just as quietly. You would not have stayed. Claire did not argue, because part of her knew he was right, but that did not make it easier. She looked at him, searching for something real beneath the layers of control. And now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian met her eyes, steady, but no longer distant. Now, he said slowly, I am not sure if I want you to stay because of the contract anymore. And that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make the ground beneath them feel uncertain in a way neither of them could ignore. The air between them did not return to what it was before. Something had been opened, something neither of them knew how to close again. And for a few days, everything felt quieter, not distant, but careful, like both of them were stepping around something fragile they had not yet named. Claire noticed the changes first in the smallest ways. Adrian lingered a second longer when he spoke to her, his eyes no longer sliding past hers but holding them, as if searching for something he could not quite define. He asked if she had eaten, not as part of routine, but because he wanted to know, and when she answered, he actually listened. But the softness did not make things easier. It made them more complicated, because now she could feel the difference, and that difference made the contract feel less like protection, and more like a line they were both beginning to cross. One evening, everything shifted again, not inside the quiet walls of the penthouse, but out in the world that had never truly accepted her. It started with a headline, then another, then a flood of voices she could not escape, articles questioning her background, her worth, her place beside Adrian Vale, photos pulled from her past, the small apartment, the worn clothes, the hospital visits, everything exposed under harsh light, and the words were not loud, but they were sharp, calling her a convenience, a calculated choice, a girl lifted from nothing and placed where she did not belong. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, her phone still in her hand, her chest tight in a way she had not felt since before all of this began. The scarf around her neck suddenly too warm, too heavy, like it was holding memories she could not carry right now. When Adrian walked in, he saw it immediately, the stillness in her posture, the silence. That was no longer calm. Claire, he said, stepping closer, but she stood before he could reach her, placing the phone on the table between them as if it was something neither of them wanted to touch. Was this part of the plan too? She asked, her voice steady, but not soft anymore. Adrian's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something sharper, focused. No, he said, picking up the phone, scanning the headlines quickly, his jaw tightening just slightly. This is not supposed to happen. Claire let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but it carried no warmth. But it did, she said, and for the first time, there was a distance in her eyes that had not been there before. They are not wrong, she continued, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table. I am exactly what they are saying I am. Adrian shook his head, stepping closer again. You are not, he said, his voice firm now. But Claire did not step back. She did not move at all. Then what am I? She asked. And the question hung there, heavier than anything else. Adrian opened his mouth, but for a moment, no answer came, because the truth he had started to feel was not something he knew how to say yet. And That silence was enough. Claire nodded once, small, controlled. That is what I thought, she said quietly, turning away before the weight of it could show more than she wanted him to see. Claire, Adrian said again, reaching for her wrist, not forcefully, just enough to stop her from leaving completely, and she paused, but did not turn back. I can fix this, he said, the words automatic, the solution he had always relied on. Control, power, influence. But Claire shook her head slowly, pulling her hand free. That is the problem, she said, her voice softer now, but more certain than ever. You always think this is something to fix, she turned then, her eyes meeting his, and there was no hesitation left in them. But I am not a situation, Adrian, she said. I am a person who did not know she was being chosen like a strategy. The words landed quietly, but they cut deeper than anything louder could have. Adrian stood still, the distance between them suddenly wider than the room itself. I did not mean for it to hurt you, he said. And this time, it was not controlled, it was real. But Claire only nodded, because she believed him, and somehow that made it worse. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it still does. And for the first time since she walked into his world, she stepped away not because she was lost, but because she understood exactly where she stood, and she was no longer sure she wanted to stay there. Claire did not leave that night, but something in her did, something quiet and trusting that had slowly begun to grow, and in the days that followed, the space between her and Adrian was no longer filled with soft awareness, but with something colder, more careful. She still moved through the penthouse, still followed the schedule, still stood beside him at events, but the way she looked at him had changed. No longer searching, no longer open, just present, like she was already halfway gone. Adrian felt it in every silence, in every step she took that no longer aligned with his without effort. And for the first time, control did not feel like strength. It felt like distance he could not close. One evening, after a long day that stretched into another late return, he found her on the balcony, the city lights below reflecting softly in her eyes. Her cream scarf wrapped tightly around her neck as the wind moved through the quiet space. She did not turn when he stepped closer, but she knew he was there. You should not be out here. It is cold, he said, the words simple, but carrying something more than concern. Claire gave a small nod. I like the quiet, she replied, her voice calm, but distant. Adrian stood beside her, not too close, not too far. The space between them measured in everything they had not said. I spoke to legal, he said after a moment. The media will be handled. The articles will be taken down. Claire let out a soft breath, almost tired. That is not the part that stays, she said, finally turning to look at him, and the honesty in her eyes made it impossible for him to look away. What stays is how it felt, she continued, reading about myself like I was something you picked from a list. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, but in something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to face before. You were not a list, he said, his voice lower now, less controlled. Claire tilted her head slightly. Then what was I? She asked again, and this time, Adrian did not hesitate, not because the answer was easy, but because he could not avoid it anymore. You were the only person who did not look away, he said, the words quiet, but steady. Claire's expression shifted just slightly, not softened, but listening. At the hospital, he continued, his gaze no longer distant, but fixed on her. Everyone else was there for a reason, for money, for obligation, for themselves, but you stayed for someone who had nothing to give you back. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her scarf, the memory returning more clearly now. I saw you, Adrian said, his voice almost a whisper, and I could not forget it. The wind moved between them, carrying the weight of his words into the silence. So when I needed someone, he continued, I chose the one person I thought would not pretend to care. Claire held his gaze, her breath steady, but her chest tightening in a way she could not ignore. You still made it a contract, she said softly, and Adrian nodded once, because there was no denying that, because I did not know how to ask for anything real, he admitted. And that was the first time his voice carried something unguarded, something close to fear. Claire looked at him, really looked, and for a moment, she saw it. Not the CEO, not the man who controlled everything, but the part of him that had learned to turn every feeling into a transaction just to keep it from breaking him. You think if you put everything in terms, it cannot hurt you, she said quietly, and Adrian did not respond, because it was true, and they both knew it. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of everything that had been hidden between them. I needed you to be honest, Claire said after a moment, her voice softer now, but still holding its ground. Not perfect, not powerful, just honest. Adrian exhaled slowly, the weight of that settling. Deeper than anything else she had said. I am trying, he said, and this time, it was not a statement. It was something closer to a promise, fragile, uncertain, but real. Claire looked out at the city again, the lights no longer as distant as before. Trying is not the same as knowing how, she said, and Adrian stepped just slightly closer, not enough to close the distance, but enough to show he was not walking away. Then stay, he said quietly, and let me learn. Claire's eyes closed for a brief second, the wind brushing softly against her face, and when she opened them again, she did not move toward him, but she did not step away either, and in that stillness, something remained, not whole, not certain, but not broken beyond repair either. The room held its breath as Adrian's words settled, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, the kind of truth that did not ask for approval. Claire stood there, her hands still, her heart anything but. She had imagined many ways this could unfold, but not like this, not with him standing in front of everyone, removing the one thing that had protected him, the contract, the control, the distance, and leaving himself open in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. The cameras flashed again, voices began to rise, questions thrown into the space, but none of it reached her. All she could see was him, the man who once measured everything, now choosing something he could not predict. Adrian did not turn back to the audience. He stayed facing her, waiting, not demanding, not expecting, just waiting, and that was new. That was the part that changed everything. Claire took a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her cream scarf, grounding herself in something real, something that belonged to her before any of this began. She stepped forward, not quickly, not hesitating either, just steady, each step closing the distance that had grown between them over time. The room watched, but it no longer mattered, because this moment was no longer about them. It was about the space between two people who had finally stopped hiding behind what was safe. She stopped just in front of him, close enough to see the tension he was not masking, the uncertainty he was not controlling. You said I could choose, she said softly, her voice not loud, but clear enough to reach him through everything else. Adrian nodded once, his eyes not leaving hers. Yes, he answered, and there was no condition attached, no hidden expectation, just the truth. Claire studied him for a moment longer, searching for the same distance he used to hold, but it was not there anymore. Only something quieter, something real, and that was what made the difference. Then this time, she said, her voice steady, but softer now. I am not staying because you asked. Adrian's breath slowed, not interrupting, not filling the silence, letting her finish. I am staying because I see you trying, she continued, her eyes not breaking away from his. And that matters more than anything you could have offered me before. The words settled between them, not perfect, not complete, but enough. Adrian did not reach for her immediately. He did not close the distance without permission, but something in his expression shifted, something lighter, something that had not been there before, relief, quiet and real, and for the first time, the space between them did not feel like something to cross. It felt like something they were already sharing. The noise slowly returned, voices rising, cameras flashing, but something had already shifted beyond all of it. Claire stood beside Adrian not as part of an arrangement, not as a role to fill, but as someone who had chosen to stay, and that choice carried a quiet strength that no contract could ever hold. Adrian exhaled slowly.